I saw the light sweep across the rocks, slow and deliberate, as if it knew I was watching. And for a split second, I swear I saw someone inside the lantern room. Someone who shouldn't have been there. I'd taken a weekend trip up the coast that summer, chasing a bit of solitude after a rough few months. The little seaside town I stayed in was famous for one thing: its old lighthouse, perched on a cliff that seemed to crumble directly into the sea. It hadn't been active for decades, but they offered guided tours during daylight hours. The sign outside read, "Last tour ends at 6 p.m. I got there at 5:40. The guide, an older man with a voice like dry rope, agreed to give me the quick version, since I was his last visitor of the day. Inside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of salt and rust. My footsteps echoed up the spiral staircase, each creak swallowed by the thick stone walls. We climbed to the top, where the lantern room still housed the massive glass lens. "Hasn't been lit since 1971, the guide said, tapping the frame. "They took the light out years ago." I remember looking out over the churning water, the wind cutting through the glass like it wasn't even there. The sun was just beginning to slip toward the horizon, painting the ocean in copper and gray. The whole place felt still in a way that didn't feel right. The guide ushered me back down, locking the heavy metal door behind us. I lingered outside, taking a few photos as he walked toward his truck. That's when I noticed it. A faint, warm glow flickered in the lantern room above. At first, I thought it was just the setting sun catching the glass at the perfect angle, until the light began to rotate, slowly, purposefully. I squinted, shielding my eyes against the wind. There was a figure up there, broad-shouldered, hunched slightly, wearing what looked like an old-fashioned oilskin coat. He was leaning over the lens, adjusting something. "Hey!" I called out, instinctively glancing toward the guide, who was halfway to his truck. When I pointed, the man's face paled. He looked up at the lantern room, then back at me. "There's no one in there," he said flatly. "I just saw someone. He was moving around." He shook his head, his expression tightening. "Son, there hasn't been a keeper here for over 50 years. And no one goes up there without my key." The rational part of me tried to explain it away. Maybe it was a reflection. Maybe someone had broken in. But as we stood there, the glow in the lantern room dimmed, not like a bulb being switched off, but like a flame dying out. And the figure was gone. The guide told me it was time to leave, and I didn't argue. Still, something gnawed at me. My rental cabin was just a short walk down the coast, and from its porch, I had a clear view of the lighthouse. That night, as the wind rattled the windows, I poured myself a drink and sat outside, watching the dark outline of the tower against the sky. Around midnight, the light came back. It didn't sweep the sea the way a modern beam would. Instead, it pulsed slowly, almost like it was breathing. I stood there, rooted to the spot, and I could just make out that same hunched figure in the lantern room, moving in the glow. I don't know what possessed me, but I grabbed my flashlight and jacket and started toward the cliff path. The closer I got, the more the wind seemed to push against me, whipping my jacket, stinging my eyes with salt spray. When I reached the base of the lighthouse, the door, the one I'd watched the guide lock, was wide open. The metal hinges groaned in the wind. Inside, the air was damp and colder than it should have been. My flashlight beam shook as I aimed it up the spiral staircase. For a moment, I thought I heard footsteps above me, slow and deliberate, matching the pace of the rotating light. I climbed. Halfway up, the beam of my flashlight caught something on the wall. Deep scratch marks gouged into the stone, as if someone had clawed at it with bare hands. They led upward. When I reached the lantern room, my stomach dropped. The place was exactly as I'd seen it earlier that day, except the lens was turning, slowly, silently, and beside it, facing away from me, was the man in the oilskin coat. The smell hit me first. Damp wool, salt, and something faintly metallic, like rust. "Sir?" I managed, my voice barely audible over the wind, screaming against the glass. He turned. His face was pale and drawn, eyes clouded like sea glass. Water dripped steadily from his coat, pooling at his feet. His lips moved, but the sound that came out wasn't words. It was the low, hollow moan of wind through a cave. I backed toward the stairs, my legs trembling, but he took a step forward. The light brightened, flooding the room with a sickly yellow glow that made the walls seem to pulse. Then, just as my foot hit the first step down, the light went out. I don't remember running down the stairs, only the slam of the front door as I burst outside, gasping for air. When I looked back, the lantern room was dark. The next morning, I went to the tour office to return the flashlight I'd borrowed. The guide was there, watching me carefully. "You went back last night, didn't you?" he said quietly. I didn't answer. He sighed. "They say the last keeper stayed too long. Storm took his boat before he could leave. Some folks think he's still making sure the light stays on. Problem is, it hasn't saved anyone in a long time." I left that afternoon, but sometimes when I can't sleep, I'll check the town's live harbor camera online. And every now and then I'll see a faint, slow beam sweeping across the waves, and a shadow in the lantern room, watching. The first 2 knocks sounded almost friendly. The third one felt like the ocean itself was trying to get inside. I was only supposed to be there for one night. The town had asked for volunteers to watch the old lighthouse while the main keeper was away, more for tradition than necessity. Since the place had been running on automated lights for years, I didn't mind. I figured it would be quiet, maybe even peaceful. That night, though, a storm rolled in hard from the Atlantic. The wind howled against the tower, and sheets of rain rattled the windows. The place felt alive, the kind of alive that makes you aware of every groan in the walls and every flicker of shadow on the staircase. I settled in the watchroom with a thermos of coffee, listening to the rain on the glass. The sound was almost hypnotic. That's when I heard it. 2 knocks. Polite, even. Just a soft tap-tap against the heavy wooden door at the base of the lighthouse. For a moment, I thought I imagined it. Who would be out here in weather like this? The nearest house was a mile away down the cliff path. Still, I grabbed my flashlight and made my way down the spiral stairs, the metal steps slick with damp. The wind roared outside, but down here, the sound of the ocean was muffled. I hesitated at the door. "Hello?" I called out. My voice sounded smaller than I expected. Nothing. I pressed my ear to the door, hearing only the hiss of rain. My fingers brushed the latch, but I didn't open it. Whoever was out there had to be soaked through and freezing. And yet, something in me wanted to wait. That's when it came. The third knock. It wasn't a knock so much as a slam. A deep, shuddering impact that made the door tremble on its hinges and sent vibrations up through the floor. The lantern above my head swayed, scattering shadows over the stone walls. I stumbled back, my heart hammering. No one could hit a door that hard without breaking something. I ran back up to the watchroom, every instinct screaming at me to keep distance between myself and that door. My breathing was loud in the tight space, mixing with the wind outside. Then I heard it again, not knocking this time, but the sound of wet footsteps on the outer stairs. One slow step at a time. Climbing. There's a small balcony that wraps around the watchroom, just outside the glass. I couldn't see anyone through the rain-streaked panes, but I could hear them circling the tower, dragging their feet like they were pulling the weight of the ocean with them. I tried the radio, nothing but static. The storm must have been interfering. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, all I heard was the storm. Then something heavy brushed against the glass behind me. I spun around, and my flashlight beam caught it. A dark, water-slicked handprint smeared across the outside of the window. It was high, higher than any person should be able to reach without leaning dangerously over the railing. I backed toward the inner staircase, the cold air seeping through the glass, making my skin prickle. I didn't want to go down. Whatever had knocked on that door might still be there, but I couldn't stay up here with it just outside the window. I made it halfway down before the sound started again. Not from above this time. From inside. 3 knocks. Slow. Measured. Coming from the other side of the stairwell wall. The hairs on my neck stood up. That wall faced the open sea. I took the steps 2 at a time, burst into the base room, and slammed the door latch shut. Not that I'd ever opened it. My hands shook so badly I could barely hold the flashlight. Then I saw it. Water. A thin line of it seeping under the door, spreading across the stone floor like it was being pulled in, not pushed out. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the upper stairs with my back to the wall, watching that line of water inch forward and listening to the storm batter the tower. No more knocks came, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting. By morning, the rain had stopped. The door was dry. No sign of water on the floor. I stepped outside cautiously, scanning the cliffs. The stone steps down to the shore were slick with seawater, but there were no footprints, no signs anyone had been there at all. When the main keeper returned that afternoon, I told him what happened. His expression didn't change until I mentioned the 3 knocks. Then he went quiet. "Never answer the third one?" he finally said. "That's not someone looking to come in. That's something trying to get you to let it." I left that night, but I still hear it sometimes, faint, under the wind when a storm rolls in. 2 polite taps, and then the one that shakes your bones. The beam swept across my window like it was searching for me, and for some reason I felt like it had finally found me. I'd come to the coast that week for one reason: photography. The old lighthouse here was famous among landscape shooters, perched on a cliff that jutted into the Atlantic like a crooked finger. It was undergoing maintenance, which meant the light was off. No harsh beam to ruin my long exposure night shots. That evening, I met the caretaker, a middle-aged woman named Ruth, who locked up the grounds each night. She warned me the power to the lantern had been cut entirely. "Not even a backup generator running," she said. "You'll just see a dark tower." I was renting a small cabin about 200 yards down the coast, just within sight of the lighthouse. The waves were rough that night, hammering the rocks. After reviewing my shots, I turned in around midnight, the sound of the wind and surf lulling me to sleep. I woke up at 3:07 a.m. The cabin was dark, but my walls weren't. They were lit by a faint, moving glow. I sat up, confused, and looked toward the window. The lighthouse beacon was turning. The light swept slowly across the cliff, across the churning sea, and then directly into my cabin, pausing as if it were holding there for a moment. Then it kept turning. My first thought was that maybe the repairs had been finished early, or someone had turned the system back on. But it was completely silent. I'd been around functioning lighthouses before. You could always hear the hum of machinery, the low grind of the rotation. This one moved without a sound. I grabbed my camera and coat, telling myself I'd just go get a shot at it. Some weird part of me wanted to prove it was on. The air outside was sharp and salty, the wind carrying mist off the crashing waves. My boots crunched over wet gravel as I made my way toward the path. The closer I got, the stranger it felt. The light wasn't illuminating the ocean the way it should have. It was fixed on the shore, sweeping across the land more than the water. Every time the beam passed over me, I felt a faint, prickling heat on my skin, like standing too close to a fire. When I reached the locked gate, I froze. It was wide open. The chain hung loose, swaying slightly in the wind. I stepped through, my heart pounding harder now. I tried to convince myself the caretaker must have forgotten to lock it, but something about that place in the dead of night made me doubt every reasonable thought. I started up the cliff steps, the light above me, turning, turning, turning. No sound, not even the creak of old metal. My breath was loud in my ears. Halfway up, I looked out toward the water, and that's when I realized the beam wasn't moving normally. It wasn't sweeping the horizon in even intervals. It was following me. My mouth went dry. I turned away and climbed faster, every step echoing off the stone. By the time I reached the heavy door at the base of the tower, the beam was pouring directly down onto it, bathing me in blinding light. The door was slightly ajar. Inside, the air was colder, heavy with the smell of wet stone. My flashlight beam darted across the curved walls, catching rusted hooks and coils of rope. The spiral staircase rose into shadow. I hesitated. Part of me wanted to turn back, but the other part, the stupid part, wanted to see who was up there. Each step up was damp and slick. As I climbed, I noticed the light coming from above wasn't steady. It flickered, like a flame being disturbed. But the lighthouse had no flame. It hadn't for a century. When I reached the lantern room, I stopped dead. The great lens was rotating, but there was no bulb, no wiring, no power source. Instead, at the center, there was something else. It looked like a swirling liquid glow, the color of moonlight on deep water. Standing beside, it was a figure in a long waterlogged coat, head bowed. They didn't move until I stepped forward. Then, slowly, the head turned toward me. The face, if it was a face, was pale and blurred, features shifting like ripples on a pond. The eyes were nothing but two faintly glowing points. And then, without a sound, the figure raised its arm and pointed directly out the window toward the sea. I followed the gesture. Far below, at the base of the cliff, the waves were pulling back unnaturally far, exposing jagged black rock. Something enormous was rising from the water, its shape obscured by the shadows, but its surface glistening wet and smooth. The figure took a step toward me. My instincts finally kicked in, and I turned and bolted down the stairs, my footsteps slamming against the metal. The light followed me the whole way, chasing me out the door, down the path, all the way back to my cabin. I slammed the door and yanked the curtains shut, heart thundering in my ears. The light swept across my window again, once, twice, and then was gone. By morning, the lighthouse was dark. The gate was locked. The caretaker swore she'd been there all night, and that no one had turned anything on. I left the next day. But a week later, when I was home, I checked the photos on my camera. The last shot I'd taken was from outside the cabin at 3:12 a.m. I don't remember taking it. But in the frame, the lighthouse is lit, the beam fixed on me. And in the light, there's a tall, shadowed figure standing just a few feet behind where I was. It was too high for anyone to reach, and too fresh to be old. A perfect wet handprint on the outside of the glass, 80 feet above the ocean. I'd been the seasonal keeper for Graymarsh Lighthouse for just under 2 months when it happened. The lighthouse was remote, perched on a jagged cliff where the wind never seemed to stop howling. My mornings usually started in the lantern room, checking the lens for salt spray and gull droppings. That day was foggy, the kind where you can barely see 20 feet ahead, and the sea blends into the sky like one endless gray wall. The air inside the lantern room was cool and still, but the glass was streaked from the night's mist, so I set about cleaning it. I'd worked my way halfway around the room when I saw it. A single handprint, pressed against the outside of the glass. It was larger than mine, fingers long and thin, each ridge of the palm sharply defined. Droplets of water still clung to the shape, running slowly down the pane. I froze, staring at it. The lantern room sat atop the tower. No balcony, no scaffolding, no way for anyone to stand outside that glass without, well, without falling to their death. Below was nothing but 80 feet of sheer cliff face and crashing waves. I told myself it was condensation, maybe some weird pattern from the mist, but the shape was too perfect, too human. I leaned close, trying to see if maybe it had formed from inside, but the smears and droplets clearly ran downward on the outer surface. A cold shiver went through me, and I backed away. The rest of the day, I couldn't stop glancing at that spot. The fog never lifted, and from up there, the world outside looked like nothing but shifting gray. By evening, the handprint was gone, not faded, but completely vanished, as if the glass had been wiped clean. That night, the foghorn groaned through the dark like some great, lonely animal. I slept in the keeper's quarters at the base of the tower, but I couldn't settle. Every creak of the old beams seemed louder than usual. Around midnight, I heard something else, a faint tapping sound from above. At first, I thought it was just the wind or some loose fixture, but it was too deliberate. 3 taps, a pause, then 2 more. It was coming from the lantern room. I climbed the spiral stairs, flashlight in hand. The tapping stopped halfway up, replaced by a deep, muffled sound, like something heavy brushing against the glass. When I reached the top, my breath caught. The fog outside was so thick it pressed against the glass like smoke. And there, directly in front of me, was another handprint. It was in the same spot as before, but this time there was another beside it, smaller. I just stood there, listening to the wind moan through the tiny gaps in the frame, my heart pounding in my ears. My flashlight beam reflected off the glass, but the fog beyond was impenetrable. Then the glass shuddered. It wasn't a trick of the wind. I felt it through the soles of my boots. A soft, slow vibration, as though something had pressed against the outside and was pushing harder. That broke whatever spell had kept me standing there. I backed away, turned, and all but ran down the stairs. I locked the heavy iron door to the lantern room, telling myself it was just for my own peace of mind. The tapping didn't come back. Not that night. But over the next week, the handprints returned. Always in the same place, sometimes 1, sometimes 2. Once there were 3, each of them different sizes. They'd be there in the morning, fresh and wet, and gone by afternoon. I stopped cleaning the glass entirely, afraid I'd have to touch them. The final night I spent there was during another thick fog. The foghorn was moaning, the waves pounding against the cliffs, and I was in bed, trying not to listen for anything out of place. Around 2 I heard it, not tapping this time, but a long, dragging scrape against the glass above me, like nails or fingertips sliding slowly across it. And then 3 heavy thuds, not from the stairs. From outside, I forced myself not to go up. Instead, I lay there, heart in my throat, until the sound faded. The next morning, when I finally climbed to the lantern room, the fog was gone. The sea was calm, and covering nearly the entire pane of glass in front of me was a massive smeared handprint, the water dripping down in slow rivulets. It was twice the size of the others. I gave notice that afternoon. The caretaker who replaced me said the prints stopped for a while. But the last time we spoke, she mentioned in an offhand way that they'd started again. And now, she said, sometimes they're not on the glass at all. Sometimes they're on the inside. The voice was calm, measured, and steady. But no one had broadcast from this lighthouse in over 30 years. I was 22 when I got the internship. It wasn't glamorous work, more of a keep an eye on things kind of deal while the senior keeper took a couple nights off. The lighthouse was still active, automated for the most part, but they liked having someone on site in case of emergencies. It was early autumn, and the wind coming off the Atlantic cut through my jacket as I unlocked the door. Inside, the stone walls trapped the cold, and the place smelled faintly of salt and old rope. The watchroom was about halfway up the tower, a narrow circular space with a desk, a few logbooks, and an old radio mounted to the wall. The radio was broken. The senior keeper, Mark, told me it hadn't worked in years. "We've got modern comms now," he'd said, tapping the satellite phone. "That thing's just a relic." The first few hours were uneventful. I logged the weather at 10 p.m., paced the balcony outside, and watched the beam sweep over the dark water. The rhythmic flash was hypnotic, almost soothing. By midnight, I'd settled into the creaky chair in the watchroom with a thermos of coffee. The wind rattled the glass in its frame. I was reading through one of the old logbooks when I heard it. A voice. It was faint at first, like a murmur in the next room. I froze, listening. Wind at 15 knots. Visibility, 1 nautical mile. It was coming from the old radio. I stood slowly, staring at the unit. The voice was male, calm, and deliberate, reciting weather data in a steady rhythm. The signal was perfectly clear. No static, no distortion. I reached for the dial, even though I knew it shouldn't be working. The moment my fingers touched the metal, the voice stopped. Silence. The room suddenly felt smaller, the shadows deeper. I told myself it was interference. Maybe the speaker still worked somehow. I went back to the desk, but I couldn't focus on the logbook. 15 minutes later, it started again. Low tide at 0243. Barometer falling steadily. This time, I didn't move. I just listened. The voice went on for nearly a minute, then ended with visibility deteriorating. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I grabbed the satellite phone and called Mark. It took him a minute to answer, and when I told him what I was hearing, he was silent for a moment before saying, "That radio has no power source. If you're hearing something on it, lock the watchroom and stay downstairs." The line went dead. I tried to follow his advice, but curiosity got the better of me. Around 2:30, the voice returned. Only this time, it wasn't giving weather reports. "You shouldn't be here." The words were delivered in the same calm, measured tone, but they sank into my stomach like ice. I stood, backing toward the staircase. My foot hit the first step when the voice spoke again. "Come upstairs." I froze. Upstairs meant the lantern room. Every instinct told me to get out of that tower, but something in the way it said those words, steady, insistent, but not loud, made my legs move. I climbed slowly, the old metal steps groaning under my weight. The higher I went, the colder it got. My breath was fogging in the air by the time I reached the lantern room. The glass walls glistened with condensation, and the massive lens rotated silently in its housing. The room was empty. I was about to turn back when I noticed something in the reflection of the lens, the faint outline of a man standing just behind me. He was tall, wearing a heavy coat, his face pale and indistinct. I spun around. No one was there. The reflection was gone. I bolted down the stairs, my footsteps echoing off the stone, not stopping until I was in the keeper's quarters at the base. I slammed the door, locked it, and sat in the dark, listening. The radio came on again around 3:15. Storm warning, wind rising, keep the light on. I didn't sleep that night. When Mark returned in the morning, I told him everything. He didn't laugh, didn't tell me I'd imagined it. Instead, he said, "The last keeper here before automation, his name was Grant, used to give weather reports every hour on the dot. They found him dead in the lantern room during a storm, leaning on that radio mic. I quit the internship that day. Sometimes, though, when the wind's right, I swear I can still hear him, calm, steady, and just clear enough to make out the words. And I'll never forget the last thing I heard before I left that tower for good. You'll be back." It circled the rocks all night, never getting closer, never drifting away. And when I finally turned the light on it, the boat didn't just disappear. It sank into nothing. I was the only keeper on duty that night, at Marin Point Lighthouse. Early winter had brought sharp winds and a moonless sky, the kind where the horizon melts into black water and you can't tell where the ocean ends and the night begins. The first time I noticed the boat, it was just after 10 p.m. I'd stepped out onto the narrow balcony beneath the lantern room to check the weather. The wind stung my face, the salt air making my eyes water. That's when I spotted a faint shape in the distance. A small fishing boat, its outline lit dimly by a weak deck light. It was circling the rocks about a quarter-mile offshore. That was odd in itself. Nobody with sense lingered near Marin Point's rocks. At currents, they were vicious. I expected to see them change course, head for the harbor, but they didn't. I watched for another 10 minutes before heading back inside, making a note in the logbook about the sighting. The night dragged on, the usual low hum of the lantern's rotation, the occasional groan of the tower in the wind. Around midnight, I checked again. The boat was still there, same distance from shore, same slow, lazy circle around the rocks. I picked up the binoculars. Through the lens, I could see the boat's deck was empty. No one at the helm, no movement at all. The weak light on board swayed with the waves, but otherwise it was as if the thing was anchored in place, waiting. By 2 a.m., my unease had turned into something heavier. I decided to swing the beam directly toward it. The lantern at Marin Point is old but powerful. When the full beam hits something, you can see every detail in stark relief. I timed the rotation so the light caught the boat head on. For a split second, I saw it perfectly. The peeling paint, the name half faded on the bow, the glisten of water pooled on deck. Still no sign of anyone aboard. Then the beam passed, and when it came around again, the boat was gone. Not drifting farther out, not slipping behind the rocks, just gone. The sea was empty in that direction, black water and whitecaps, nothing else. I stood frozen on the balcony, the cold biting through my coat. The disappearance made no sense. Even in rough water, a boat doesn't just vanish between sweeps of the light. I stayed up the rest of the night, scanning the horizon, but the boat never returned. By morning, I told myself it must have been a trick of the light. Maybe they'd cut their deck lamp and slipped out to sea without me noticing, but part of me didn't believe that. 2 nights later, just after midnight, I saw it again. Same distance offshore, same slow circle around the rocks. Only this time, there was no deck light. I only spotted it when the lighthouse beam grazed it, the pale hull glowing briefly before fading into the dark again. I went for the binoculars, but the moment I raised them, a wave of nausea hit me. It wasn't seasickness. I was on solid ground, but a deep, rolling sickness that seemed to rise from somewhere far below. I lowered the binoculars, and the feeling passed. I didn't shine the beam on it that night. I just let it circle. By dawn, it was gone again. Over the next week, the sightings kept happening. Always after midnight, always in the same spot. Sometimes it would be there for an hour, sometimes until first light. And always, when I looked too closely, that same creeping sickness. I finally asked the old harbor master about it. His expression darkened immediately. "You've seen the Maraz whale," he said. "Went down off the point 30 years ago. Storm took her quick. Crew never made it to shore. Some say she turns up before bad weather. Some say she's looking for someone." The way he said that last part stuck with me. Last night was the worst. The fog rolled in thick and wet, swallowing the beam after only a few hundred yards. Around 1 in the morning, I stepped outside, and there it was again, circling slower than I'd ever seen it. I could hear the water slapping against its hull, even from that distance, though the wind should have drowned it out. This time, the sickness came before I even lifted the binoculars. My hands shook as I reached for the lantern controls. I don't know why I did it. Maybe I wanted to end the cycle, to see what happened if I forced the light to stay fixed on it. I cranked the rotation lock, and the beam froze, pouring white light onto the boat. And that's when I saw them. Figures, 4, maybe 5, standing on the deck. Their clothes hung in tatters, dripping dark water, their faces pale and indistinct. None of them moved, except for one, taller than the rest, who raised an arm slowly and pointed directly at me. My breath hitched. The tower suddenly felt unbearably small, the air too thin. Then, as I watched, the boat began to sink. Not tilt, not roll, just drop straight down into the black water, the figures never breaking their stare. In seconds, it was gone. The beam shone on empty waves. The forecast tonight calls for calm seas, clear skies. But I've already seen a thin light moving out there beyond the rocks. I know it'll be there when midnight comes. And I know, somehow, that one night soon, it's going to stop circling. When the last brick came free, the smell of seawater rushed out, and the candle inside flickered like it knew we were watching. I was part of the small crew, hired to help restore old Bracken's Point Lighthouse. The structure had been abandoned for nearly 40 years, weather-beaten and salt-eaten, but the Historical Society wanted it safe enough for tours. We were patching cracks in the tower when Eli, one of the masons, called us over. He found something odd, a small section of brickwork about 20 feet up that didn't match the rest of the wall. The mortar was newer, the bricks cleaner. It didn't belong to the original construction. "Looks like they covered something up," he said, tapping it with his chisel. The sound was hollow. At first, we thought maybe it had been a vent or a narrow maintenance window. The plans we'd been given showed nothing. But curiosity got the better of us, and by late afternoon, we were carefully prying the bricks free. When the final brick loosened, it clattered to the floor, and that's when we saw it. A small window, glass intact. And on the other side, in a narrow, pitch-black chamber, wedged between the outer wall and the inner stairwell, was a single candle. It was lit. The flame burned steady, no flicker from our movement, no draft to feed it. The wax was pale, untouched by time. The air that poured out through the opening was damp and cold, and carried with it the briny, almost metallic scent of the sea. We all just stood there staring. "That's impossible," Eli muttered. "How's it burning?" We called up to Henry, the project manager, who came down from the lantern room. He crouched, peered through the glass, and told us to leave it be. Old keepers used to pull all kinds of stunts, probably some trick lamp, but his voice had no conviction in it. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The way the candlelight had seemed wrong. Not warm and soft, but sharp, like it was cutting into the dark instead of chasing it away. The next morning, the window was gone. From the inside, I mean. Someone or something had bricked it up again. The mortar was fresh, the bricks still damp. None of us had done it. We'd all left together the evening before, and the lighthouse was locked. Henry brushed it off as vandals, but the nearest town was a mile down the coast, and who would risk climbing scaffolding in the dark just to seal a window shut? 2 nights later, I woke to the sound of tapping. I was staying in a small trailer we'd parked near the site, and at first I thought it was just the wind shaking the aluminum siding. But the tapping was rhythmic. 3 taps, pause, 3 more, coming from the direction of the tower. I stepped outside. The lighthouse loomed above in the moonlight, its lantern dark, the scaffolding creaking softly. And about 20 feet up, where we'd found the window, I saw a faint orange glow. The candle was burning again. The next day, I told Eli, and he admitted he'd seen it too on his way back from the pub the night before. "Wasn't just a glow," he said. "I saw something move in there, like someone leaning close to the glass." We decided to check it out before Henry arrived. The bricks were there again, but they were old this time, the same weathered color as the rest of the wall, like they'd been in place for decades. Still, we chipped them away. When the last one came loose, the chamber inside was empty. No candle. Just damp stone and the smell of seawater. We stood there in silence, listening. The tower has its own kind of quiet, the kind where you can hear the sea inside the walls. But beneath that, I swear I heard something else. A slow, wet drip, like water falling onto stone far, far below. Henry was furious when he found out we'd reopened it. He ordered us to seal it up for good. That evening, Eli and I worked in silence, neither of us willing to admit how uneasy we felt. By the time the last brick was in place, the sun was setting. The wind had picked up, rattling the scaffolding. As we climbed down, I glanced back up at the sealed spot and froze. For just a moment, I thought I saw light bleeding out through the cracks in the mortar. Faint, but steady. I didn't say anything to Eli. The project wrapped a week later. I left Bracken's Point behind, glad to be done with the damp and the endless wind. But last night, scrolling through a local news site, I saw an article about the lighthouse reopening for tours. The photo they used was taken at dusk. The lantern room was dark. But 20 feet down, in the middle of the tower's stone wall, a single window glowed with the light of a flickering candle. And if you look closely at the glass, you can see a pale face behind it, watching. The razor slipped in my hand when I saw him. He was standing right behind me in the mirror, and I could see the blood dripping from the book he was holding. I'd been living in Grayford Point Lighthouse for just over a week when it happened. It wasn't a glamorous post. The Historical Society paid me to keep the place in working order between seasonal tours. That meant logging weather reports, doing minor maintenance, and keeping vandals from sneaking in. The keeper's quarters were basic: a narrow bed, a desk, and a tiny bathroom wedged into one corner of the tower's base. The bathroom mirror was old and warped, framed in tarnished brass. It hung over a cracked porcelain sink barely big enough to wash your hands in. That morning, the wind had been screaming around the tower since before dawn, rattling the window panes and carrying the smell of salt water through every seam in the walls. I decided to shave before heading up to the lantern room for inspections. The hot water pipe in the sink barely worked, so I let the cold tap run, splashed my face, and leaned toward the mirror. The glass was speckled with age, the kind that makes your reflection look like it's dissolving. Halfway through shaving, the light in the room seemed to dim. I figured a cloud had rolled in front of the sun. I glanced up, and that's when I froze. In the mirror, behind my reflection, stood a man I'd never seen before. He was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a heavy, double-breasted coat that looked like it belonged in the 1800s. His beard was trimmed short, and his eyes were dark, fixed on me with an expression I couldn't read. In his hands was a leather-bound logbook, the edges soaked in fresh, dark red. I spun around. The bathroom was empty. My pulse pounded in my ears. I turned back to the mirror, and my reflection was alone again. I stood there for a good 30 seconds, trying to rationalize what I'd seen. Maybe it was a trick of the glass. Maybe I'd caught my own silhouette wrong. But no amount of logic explained the book in his hands, or the wet shine of what I knew was blood. The rest of the day, I couldn't shake it. Even in the lantern room, with the lens turning silently and the view stretching out to the horizon, I kept catching movement out of the corner of my eye, a shadow that would vanish the moment I looked. That night, the wind died completely, rare for the point. The silence was heavy, almost pressing. I tried to read in bed, but somewhere in the tower, I heard a faint thump, then another. Steady, measured. It was coming from below me. I crept down the spiral stairs, flashlight in hand. The sound grew louder as I reached the base. It was coming from the bathroom. The door was closed, though I never closed it. I pushed it open. The mirror was fogged over, as if someone had just taken a hot shower, but the air in the bathroom was ice cold. My breath clouded in front of me. And there, in the condensation on the glass, were words, letters drawn by a finger. Page 43. The mirror was dry to the touch. The message was written on the inside of the glass. I stumbled back, slamming the door and locking it, though I knew a lock meant nothing if whatever that was wanted in. The next morning, I told myself I wouldn't look. I'd ignore it. But curiosity gnawed at me until I was tearing through the storage closet in the keeper's quarters, where the Historical Society kept old logbooks from previous keepers. Most were brittle and faded, but at the bottom of the stack, I found one that matched the one in the mirror. Thick leather cover, brass corners, faint smell of seawater clinging to the pages. I flipped to page 43. There were only 2 lines, scrawled in messy, uneven handwriting. If you see him in the mirror, don't turn around. If you turn around, he will follow you back. The rest of the page was smeared with something brown-red, long since dried. I slammed the book shut and shoved it back into the closet, but it was too late. That night, in the glass of my bedroom window, I saw him again, standing just behind me. Closer this time, the bloodied logbook in his hands, the dark eyes locked on mine. I haven't used the bathroom mirror since. I keep it covered with a towel, but every now and then I'll catch a glimpse of my reflection in a darkened window or the polished brass in the lantern room. And there he is, closer each time. The first scream was faint, carried on the wind. The second was closer, and it was calling for help. My girlfriend Emma and I were camping for the weekend on a stretch of rocky coast near Hallows Point Lighthouse. The place was remote, the kind of spot you had to hike to, with the nearest road over a mile inland. The lighthouse itself was still operational, manned by an old keeper named Carver, who we'd met earlier that day. He was wiry, weathered, and had the kind of eyes that looked like they'd seen too much. When we mentioned we were camping on the cliffs, his expression tightened. "Don't go down to the base," he said, "especially near the caves. They've been sealed for a reason. We didn't press him on it. People who live and work in places like this usually have their superstitions." That night, low tide exposed the jagged black rocks at the cliff's base. The sound of the waves softened into a rhythmic slosh, and the beam from the lighthouse swept across the water in slow intervals. We sat by the fire, wrapped in blankets, watching the light rotate. That's when we heard it. A scream. It was faint at first, almost like it could have been the cry of a seabird, but there was a shape to it, a human edge. Emma and I locked eyes. Then came another, louder, closer, and this time there were words. "Help me." I grabbed my flashlight and walked to the cliff's edge. Far below, where the moonlight caught the rocks, there was movement near the mouth of one of the sea caves. It looked like someone staggering just beyond the entrance. Emma joined me. "We have to get down there." The descent was treacherous, but there was an old switchback trail carved into the cliffside. The wind carried another cry, definitely human now, desperate and raw. I shouted down that we were coming, but there was no reply. When we reached the base, the cave loomed ahead, black as pitch. The rock around the opening was wet and slick, smelling of brine and something sour underneath. I shined the flashlight inside. The beam caught nothing but uneven stone. And then, just for a moment, the outline of someone darting deeper into the dark. "Wait," I called, stepping forward. That's when I saw it. The entrance had been sealed before. You could see the remnants of heavy timbers and rusted chains embedded into the rock, broken open from the inside. A sound rose from the depths. Not a scream this time, but a chorus of voices, overlapping in a way that made my skin crawl. Some were whispering, some moaning, others crying out like they were drowning. Emma gripped my arm. "We need to go." I backed us toward the cliff path, but the flashlight flickered and died. In the darkness, the voices swelled, closer now, echoing off the stone until it felt like they were all around us. I could make out fragments. "Help me. It's so cold. Don't leave." Layered over each other until I couldn't tell where one ended and the next began. Something moved at the edge of the waterline. A figure, hunched and pale, crawling toward us. Its hands slapped weightily against the rock, leaving streaks of seawater that seemed too dark to be just water. Behind it, more shapes began to emerge from the cave, dragging themselves forward in jerky, unnatural motions. We ran. The climb up the switchback was brutal in the dark, our boots slipping on wet stone. Halfway up, I made the mistake of looking back. The beam from the lighthouse had swung across the base of the cliff, and for an instant I saw them clearly. A cluster of emaciated figures, eyes black, mouths open in silent screams. They froze in the light like insects caught in amber. Then the beam passed, and they moved again, faster. We stumbled into our camp, grabbed what we could, and sprinted toward the lighthouse. Carver was waiting at the door, like he'd known we were coming. Without a word, he led us inside and bolted the heavy door. "You went to the caves," he said flatly. I nodded, still trying to catch my breath. "There's people down there. They need help." Carver's expression didn't change. "They're not people anymore. Haven't been for a long time. Tide's coming in, they'll go back for now." I asked him what he meant, but he just turned away and muttered, "That's why we sealed them." We stayed in the lighthouse until morning. By then, the tide had risen, and the base of the cliffs was hidden beneath crashing waves. Our campsite was gone, washed out to sea. Before we left, Carver gave us one last warning. "If you ever hear the screams again," he said, "don't answer. They're only calling so you'll take their place." I never went back to Hallows Point, but sometimes, when I'm near the coast on a calm night, I swear I can still hear them, faint at first, then louder, until the voices overlap into a single endless plea. And every time, I turn away. Because now, I know better. The first night, I thought it was just a passing car's headlights. By the third night, I knew the beam was searching for me. A few weeks ago, I drove out to the coast to photograph the ruins of Weller's Point Lighthouse. It had been abandoned for decades after a fire gutted part of the keeper's quarters, and the access road was barely passable. The locals in the nearest town warned me it wasn't safe to go inside, not because of ghosts, but because the place was falling apart. Still, I made the climb up the narrow path. The tower rose above the cliffs, black against the overcast sky. The metal door at the base was hanging half off its hinges. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the smell of burnt wood and sea rot. My footsteps echoed up the spiral stairs. When I reached the lantern room, I found the great lens still in place, its glass panels streaked with salt. The lantern itself was gone, nothing but an empty housing. I spent about an hour taking photos before heading back down, the wind howling through the broken windows. It wasn't till I got home, hours inland, that anything strange happened. That night, as I was getting ready for bed, a sudden flash lit up my bedroom. It wasn't the burst of a camera or the steady glow of a street lamp. It was a sweeping beam, moving slowly across the room, as if from a powerful spotlight. It passed, then came back a few seconds later, like it was rotating. I went to the window. My street was dark and empty. No cars, no lights in the houses across from mine. The beam was gone. I told myself it must have been headlights bouncing off the glass in a weird way. But the next night, it came back. At 12:17 a.m., my bedroom filled with the same sweeping light. This time I stood at the window for nearly 10 minutes, trying to find its source. The street stayed empty. The light never faltered, never changed angle. It just passed over me, again and again, as if it knew I was standing there. By the third night, it wasn't just light. I was woken by the beam at exactly the same time. When it passed across my face, I felt heat, not like the warmth of the sun, but a prickling, almost feverish heat that sank into my skin and stayed there even after the light moved on. I shut the curtains. It didn't matter. The light still bled through the fabric, white and sharp, tracing my shape on the wall. Sleep was impossible. Every time my eyes closed, I saw the silhouette of the lighthouse lens, the glass turning, bending the beam until it landed on me. By the fourth night, I decided I was going to stay outside and watch for it. I sat in a chair on my front lawn with a thermos of coffee, waiting. The street was silent, the houses dark. At 12:17, the beam appeared. It didn't come from the horizon or the end of the street. It came from directly above the houses, a line of light cutting through the air, as if the source was impossibly far away and impossibly high. I followed it back with my eyes, but it vanished into the night sky. And when the beam returned, it didn't just sweep past me. It stopped. Right on me. I felt that heat again, stronger this time, and my ears filled with a low, distant hum. It sounded like wind rushing past a massive structure, or the low moan of something ancient. I couldn't move. My eyes watered, but I couldn't look away from the blinding light. When it finally shifted, I bolted back inside and locked the door. The next day, I called a friend who grew up near Weller's Point. When I told him about the light, he went quiet for a long time before saying, "You shouldn't have gone up there." He told me about the fire, how the keeper had stayed in the lantern room, even as the quarters burned below. Witnesses on the shore swore they could see him still turning the light by hand, the beam sweeping the black water until the tower collapsed. They never found his body. Some locals claimed the light still appeared offshore on foggy nights, moving inland before vanishing. And sometimes, if it found you, it didn't stop coming back. Last night was the worst yet. I woke to find the beam already in my room. The heat was unbearable, my skin slick with sweat, my vision blurred, and in the light, shapes began to form, the outline of the lens, the faint silhouette of a man behind it, hands working the crank to turn it. His face was hidden, but I could feel his eyes on me. I tried to scream, but the hum filled my head until it was all I could hear. The light passed, and I was alone again. It's 11:54 p.m. now. My curtains are closed, the lights are off, and I'm sitting on the floor, as far from the window as I can get. But I know in 23 minutes it'll be here again. And I'm starting to think that if I stand in the beam long enough, I'll see more than just his shadow.